presentation, and you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Being in a barn's worth about 10,000 pictures, because you could go over the whole, the way these things were built. Timber framing died in most of the country about the time these barns were built. And when I say these barns, the Carson Valley, the Sierra Valley, Quincy area, there's thousands of timber frame barns in the Sierras. And there are scattered ones in the Bay Area here and there, but this was the mother lode of barns because of the storage of hay. And they're all basically hay barns. And basically what it is this structure is pretty typical, I should say, in the sense that this is called I used to call it the main aisle, which is a misnomer because an aisle is an aisle. This would be the hay mow, and those are two side aisles on each side. And the aisles on the side were used either for animals, and sometimes they had a granary in them. This barn's unusual because they actually, Jack knows more about this apparatus.
It's a grain elevator.
What's that?
That's a grain elevator.
It's a grain elevator. Really? You don't see too many of those in the barns. And the way they're built, basically, this one is numbered, which is very rare. The way they're built is the first thing the carpenter would do is they would come in and they would lay the sills. The sills have been cut. There used to be a sill right in front of the barn and all in the back here. The introduction of the tractors in the 1920s, they cut all the sills in most of the barns. Most of the barns don't have those sills anymore, but originally it was built with sills all the way across.
What is a sill?
A sill is the bottom piece of the frame, which is right here. So this is there's an outside sill, and these interior sills are called purlin sills. And I'll explain why. And if you have any questions, just say so at any time. As you'll notice, what happens is timbers don't usually, you don't usually have 67-foot timbers, so you have what you call scarf joints to connect timbers. Anybody sitting here can see a scarf joint right there, and that's called a bladed scarf. One that you can see, let's see up top on the top blade. I just saw one.
Yeah.
What's that? Okay, yeah. Can anybody see that pretty well?
Yeah.
It's called a bladed scarf, and what it does is it has, instead of just being lapped, it has the top piece goes, which is a blade, goes into the other piece of wood. That way when they dry, it's very hard for it to twist, so it stays together. There's an unusual amount of scarf joints in the Carson Valley and in California barns in general. I mean, I found two that no one's seen anywhere in the United States. One's in the Van Sickle barn. And my theory on the different scarf joints is when people came here during the gold rush and the silver rush, if they were carpenters, they knew how to timber frame. And a scarf joint is, some of them are called English scarf joints, some are German. A lot of the bladed scarf is considered a German scarf joint. So my theory is, before I get ahead of myself, there's a layout system called square rule system. And the people from Europe that came here that were timber framers had to learn this layout system. And basically what it is, and sadly enough, this particular barn, he did something different. But in other words, this timber here measures 9 3/4. Let's say, and it's 8 inches this way. So originally it would be 10 by 8, the carpenter would figure. So then he would take the number 9.5 and 7.5. And that way, within a timber, you get a perfect timber. Because what it's called is a housing. So the carpenter would lay it out and cut that, so from this side, let's say to this side, he would make that 9.5. So this brace would fit in there exactly, and the logic behind that is it makes every brace in the frame of that size interchangeable. So they're all interchangeable. And this is an American layout system that came within about 1820s, because in Europe they ran out of straight trees years before that. So they did what they call scribe rule, where they would actually take the frame like this, lay it on the ground, and actually scribe the pieces that fit. And they would mark it. So this square rule system, even though it seems like more work because you cut all these housings in, really is a real time saver because it makes everything interchangeable. Okay, so the nomenclature. Okay, so as I said, this is the main aisle, this is 2 side aisles. This is called a purlin post. These 2 are called purlin posts. That's a purlin plate, and those are tie beam. That's the main, these tie beams are the main structure in the barn. If you cut those, the barn would fall apart. That's again, that's the main beam in the whole barn, and it's called a tie beam. And it's actually called the drop tie beam because it's below the plate. These purlin, this is called again, this is a purlin post with a purlin plate, and the secondary, and this barn, by the way, is built very well. Some of them, a lot of barns can cheat, and they'll just run the rafter all the way from that end to the outside, and they're really swayed back by this time in time. This is what you call, this guy here is called a canted purlin post. The one that's canted up that way, and that gives you secondary support on the rafters. A lot of barns you'll see have roofs that come on the center aisle, and then they change pitches. It's really a matter of the builder. It takes a little bit more skill to actually make the roof the same pitch, because the carpenter has to take into consideration, he has to figure out exactly how high he wants this wall to have that roof straight. So it's easier to have a broken roof, as they call it. And it's structurally, it really doesn't make any difference. Let's see, okay, so we're at the purlin post. These plates on the outside wall are just like you would call it stick frame in your top plate. The pieces along, I don't know if anybody can see from here, but the pieces along the center for siding, they're called girts. What's been added to this barn is, from original, is these lofts are new on both sides. So originally this barn was pretty well open, and I'm assuming this floor might be new or not, but
Yeah, we put the floor in, Paul.
What's that?
We put this floor in.
Okay. And there used to be beams in there. I can see where one was cut out the granite on this side. Let's see, so. Another thing that's kind of interesting, you wonder, maybe you don't wonder, but the pins are all pointed. And the reason for that is a technique called draw boring, whereas when the carpenter cuts, he'll take his square and he'll measure in here, we've got 1.5 inches, which is pretty standard, 1.5 inches, and then he'll go from the top, because this brace actually goes on an angle like this with I'm sorry, this is a tenon, this is a tenon on the end of this, and the hole in the wood is called a mortise. So that's mortise and tenon joinery. Let's say he went, so here he went about, or didn't it go about, he goes 2.5 inches. So then in these days they had right after the Civil War, they had what they call as a boring machine, where you actually sit on it, and it's like a little drill press, and you just press, and it drills a perfect hole. Before that, before the Civil War, they used just a hand auger, and you do it by eye. So then what they would do is when they put a brace in, they would take the same measurement, 1.5 inches and 2.5 inches, and then offset it so that the hole that they cut is closer to the shoulder this way, and a brace has a double draw bore, and then it's closer to the bottom. So what happens is when those holes, when the piece goes together, they're like this. And when they drive that pin in, it just sucks that joint up totally tight. And that's called draw boring. And when I first started timber framing about 25 years ago, I said, geez, that's kind of intimidating, you know. I had all these pieces cut. I said, man, it's a lot easier just to cut a hole straight through and, you know, it's done. So I tried it, I experimented, and I took a post. I was building a gate at the time, and I put a brace in, and I got it all tight and drilled through it. And you could still move it a little bit. And in the one that I draw board, you could literally pick the post up by the brace, and it was like a gun stock. It didn't move. So I was sold on that. And the other problem in today's when people timber frame, if you don't draw bore, you have to have 100 come-alongs on the job to pull things together, and then you're running around with a drill while you're paying a crane like $150 an hour while you're drilling holes. Whereas if you draw bore, you just have a bunch of pins in your pocket. And it's the way it was done traditionally. And it makes sense because when I've taken barns apart, you can actually see the pin right where it gets a connection. It's bent like that. And what's interesting too about out west here, all the pins are made out of softwood because there's not a lot of hardwood in the forest, which they don't. Back east, all the barns are done with oak or whatever, but it doesn't seem to make any difference. I mean, these pins are really, they've held together for 150 years or better.
Did they wax them before they?
No, they're.
So sometimes you'll see some goop sticking out.
What's that?
You'll see some, looks like something dripped on some of them coming out. Whether they?
No, you wouldn't wax them at any point. They're not round. They're shaped. They're actually shaped with a chisel. They would use I forget what you call it. It's a machine. Not a machine. It's a hand tool. You sit on and you shape a draw. Not a draw knife. You use a draw knife, but the machine itself, I forget what it's called. It'll come to me someday. But it actually holds the pin so that you can pull, you put your foot on it so that way you don't have to try to hold the pin and you can shave them. And most of them are octagonal. They're 8-sided. And that's just, they just bite into the wood really well like that.
What did they pound them in with?
A mallet.
Wooden?
A wooden mallet.
Because they don't seem busted up, on the end, like when they've been pounded on.
No, it's they're hard to break because they're going in. If you give it too much draw bore, you can't break them. But when you get the feel for it, you know that that's too much tension or whatnot. What was that question again? The wax, yeah. No, they didn't. And usually they were the pins were dry because you didn't want to use green wood because they would shrink too much.
Mm-hmm. How long were those typically?
I'm sorry?
How long were they, the pins?
This one here, this one was just barely over 8 inches, but usually they protrude out maybe a ½ inch past the
like
whatever size beam it is.
There's one here.
What's that?
One sticking out.
Yeah, that's you can see the point on them. So that also tells you the layout face. So back to the way they built them. First, again, they would put the whole floor. The floor system would go up, and then usually the carpenter already had the mortises laid out for his posts, and the distance these are called bays. The distance between posts are called bays. So this barn has 1, 2, 3, 4 bays. And what's unusual about this barn again is it has numbers on it. You can see it says number 1 on there, number 2 on this one, number 3 and number 4.
No, the other way.
Am I going backwards?
Yeah,
Oh.
that's 4.
Hi?
That's 4, and that's 3, and that's 2, and that's 1.
Okay, so that tells you that was a complete section of timbers that would, after the floor is up, the next thing that went up, and this is all done by hand, these 2 purlin posts would be built on the ground along with that tie beam and these two braces, that would all be laying down here. And that would get the first one on the outside here. They'd raise that one up, then they would raise the next one up, and the next one, and the next one. That complete set of timbers is known as a bent. The tie beam and the two purlin posts. It's called a bent. So after they had these up, then the next step was installing the top plates. These guys up here. And the way you can usually see the layout on a barn also is by looking at the scarf joints, because if the scarf joint, like this one here, which you can see almost, where'd it go, Jack?
Right here. Right there.
Okay, so you can see which one would be on the top and the bottom. My point being, in other words, if the barn's built this way, the scarf joint would be this one so the other one could lay on top. You wouldn't do it in reverse because it'd be too hard to put together. So that gives you the information on which way the barn was built. And all these barns, like 99% of them, are built to exact numbers. They didn't play with 1/4 inches, 1/2 inches, or 6 inches usually. Everything is in feet. So if I take a tape, let's see, how long is this sucker you got here? We'll find out. If I go from here, it'll take long enough to find out. Okay, that's exactly 22 feet. So the main aisle would be 22 feet, and then the layout from the other side, I'm saying somewhere between 16 and 18
It's
feet.
16, yeah.
16? And they would, again, these numbers would be exact. What's unusual about this barn is the whole thing I told you about square rule. This framer who did this, it looks like he actually individually cut each brace because there's no housings like I described. None of these have housings in it. And it's either, and I checked a couple of them earlier, it'd be pretty rare, but to have a mill cut all your timbers the exact perfect size. In other words, a mill, you want an 8 by 10. The chances that they would all be 8 by 10 are pretty slim. So this guy, that's why I think there's numbers in this barn, because Jack pointed out even these guys had numbers.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, and my wild guess is he was European because he didn't fully understand the square rule system. And he decided, well, I can do it this way. I mean, still, he gets the same results, but it probably took him a lot longer.
So Paul?
Yeah.
We were told by one of the people that have been in the valley for a long decades, or generations, that it was a Danish
Okay.
builder. Does that,
Yeah, they
Is that
wouldn't know,
possible?
they wouldn't have known square rule unless they were taught it by an American timber frame. So that's a good.
I think there were several here in the valley that were built by the same, he traveled through and he worked with the individual ranch owners, but he built quite a few, or several at least. In the
Yeah, and
valley.
I think Henry Hankey or Mankey was another builder that built around here too.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a couple of them.
I'm wondering if that white barn might have also, that you mentioned earlier when we were outside, might be the same builder, because it looks so similar.
Yeah, and it has the same canted purlin post in it, and it also has no housings.
Yeah, you said.
I mean, so it's very likely that, I mean, that's how you can start to learn who did what. And it's not like back east when you can, like in New England, you'll have a Dutch barn, and you know it's a Dutch barn because it's built a certain way, and it was built the same way. But out here, I mean, you know, I've decided that there is a barn, I call it, I mean, they lump all western barns into prairie barns, which is silly, because I call these a Sierra Nevada barn, because they run from here all the way to the Oregon border, and they're all built very much with the same layout. What really radically changed barn building was the invention of I think you got one up here, yeah, the hay track. It's not given enough credit for what it did, because what the hay track did is the early barns used to have side entries, like a door, like here. Well, not in the middle of it would be in one of these bays. You would have a door, because that way the hay crew would come in and they could throw the hay on both sides. Well, once you had the hay track, you eliminated that whole side entry, so you had more room in your barn. And all these doors you see, these big doors, they were not here originally. They just had man doors. There was no reason to come in here with any type of machinery. They would just unload the hay and fill it all the way up. And that was I mean, some people after that, like anything else, I can't say that every barn built after the hay track. Some people built side entries anyway because they liked it, or they might want to put a carriage in it.
And back there is a Jackson fork that was right there is a Jackson fork hanging on that wall that was probably used to bring it in here.
I'm sorry.
So you can see hanging on that wall is a part of a Jackson fork.
Oh yeah, the Jackson hay fork.
Yeah.
So you got a question? Or are you just going?
You have competition with geese.
Oh. I've had worse.
Bill happy with an old German family.
Are the doors original or maybe the Jacobs?
No,
What's that?
the doors. These are new doors.
Well, the doors, these big doors, again, were all put in the 20s so they could get tractors in. Most of them, they had what they called man doors. The bigger doors were on the side for your oxen or your cow or whatever you were putting on the sides of your grain bin. That after which most of these barns were built. The hay track was invented in 1867. So it's a really easy way to date a barn in the sense that if you see no hay track, chances are it was built before. Because one thing I found in a lot of barns that used to confuse me, I would go in and I'd look at a tie beam like this, and all of a sudden they dropped it like 4 feet. And I finally realized the reason they did it is the barn was built before the hay track, and they needed more room for the fork to go in so it didn't hit the beam, so they dropped the tie beams even lower. And like I say, sometimes you'll see a mortise up higher where the tie beam was, and that's why they did that.
What sort of wood is this?
This is almost all ponderosa pine and maybe sugar pine, but it's amazing. I mean, I don't know if we can see it on the end sills, but the forest here was so, it was all virgin wood. So you can't even count the rings. I mean, I got pieces of wood I sometimes show at talks, and you need a magnifying glass just to see the rings because they're so tight. So the builders, when they came out here, had it was like heaven, really, to have. I mean, their biggest competition was the mines, and even they actually hewed beams up till the 1920s too. Go ahead, guys.
I have a question about how they raised, you said they put these beams down on the ground and then they put it all together, and then how did they raise it?
Well, these could get raised with a block and tackle and poles, because in other words, you had you'd have enough guys or a piece on here that would stop it, so because there's a tenon on the bottom of these.
A what?
A tenon. A tenon is the male, and the mortise is the female. It goes in the hole in the beam. That's the mortise. So in other words, all these pieces you're looking at, there's a piece of wood in here that's going like that, and that's what's holding the pin.
Okay.
So there's no nails involved. So once they got these pieces, once you get the first one up, and they would brace it, then you can keep bracing these all the way, and it got easier and easier. The top plates, they literally would pull those up with ropes, and I think a lot of them, I think they used hay derricks to raise a lot of these barns. You don't see too many around. I've seen a couple that are still in.
We have some in the back. We have two of them.
Yeah, because they would be very handy for putting big beams up.
Yeah, it's like a giant lever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then after they had the main section up, basically the side walls that you see on the outside walls, they were literally built on the ground too, the whole wall, up to, let's say, a scarf joint, and you could pick that whole thing up. And these beams, these are called, oh good, you can see that from here. This is called a secondary tie beam, because it's doing the same thing as that guy up there, but it's just lower, and it's helping connect the outside wall. And then the rafters, of course, hold everything together. I mean, that's why with the winds in this valley, this barn, as you can see, it's almost perfect. I mean, I don't think it's moved at all, very little. And that's another thing you don't see a lot back east. And these aren't for earthquakes. These are called foot. I like to use foot brakes. The Germans use that, and they call those guys head braces. And foot braces you very rarely see back east, but here, I think because of the winds, the so-called Washoe Zephyr and whatnot, I think probably the first barns, if they built them without these type of bracing, they probably just literally went over very quickly. So a lot of them, and these are, I mean, this barn again is beefy. You'll see a lot of barns, these braces are made out of 4x4s. You know, this guy was, I mean, this is a real beefy barn. And this was cut with you can see the way the saw marks, you can see that this was cut with a circular saw. You know, by the mills. If it was an up-down saw, you would see straight marks. And then there's hand-hewn beams. Hand-hewn is a bad thing to say. It's just hewn because it's like saying hand. Because you can only hew by hand. So a hewn beam, and I got a buddy of mine who drives me crazy. He can tell you if the guy is left-handed or right-handed. But it's interesting that I used to think you could date a barn if it was hewed, which really is not true because a lot of barns were. I was able to talk to Richard Gansberg before he died, and he was in his 90s, and he knew Henry Henke when he built one of their barns, and he told me a story about he was a good carpenter, but he was a mean drunk. He said, because one day he said he had to do something, and Henry Henke threw, I don't know if it's Henke or Menke. He threw a hammer at him. You know, so his dad, you know, his dad asked him why he stayed out in the woods that night. So he was afraid of it. But it was interesting to talk to somebody that actually knew who built the barn. He said one day, he said that he had a little list of timbers, and he said, "Here, get these for me." And that was his whole set of plans. And it was interesting. He told me that there was a Washoe Indian that hewed all the beams in one of the barns. His name was Henry Arnett. And he spent the summer hewing beams, because I originally assumed, well, it's hewn, so it must be the oldest barn in the area because it's hewn. But because the mines were taking so many timbers, if you had your own woodlot, you were in good shape. And to hew beams, you really need trees that are the diameter doesn't change in them. If a tree grows in a field by itself, it gets all fat with branches, you know, like watching too much TV or something. And then if they grow in a forest, they really have to strive to get on top. So they're all pretty uniform. So that you could take when I built my shop years ago, I was thinking of hewing all my beams, and I was younger and crazier, but the problem was a tree might be 18 inches at the base before you get up to 12 inches and you'd be chewing forever. Whereas if you have an 11-inch beam, you can really actually hew that in a couple of hours. I mean, into a beam if you have a pretty uniform size. And weather-wise, hewn beams actually are better in the weather, exposed because of the way that they chop the grain. Oh yeah, you mean both sides here?
The one at the very, very top.
Oh, the cupola. That, yeah,
Or
that.
is it just for decoration?
No. It actually, some barns you see it in. I mean, it helps vent the barn.
Okay.
You know, it doesn't seem to be mandatory. You know, because Nevada's pretty dry. But that over there, you can see that's where they let that's where that hay would come in from, you know, from the wagons. And some barns have. This one originally did because it has a granary and it has the offshoot roof on it, which is original. But I've seen some barns that actually they've loaded from both sides of the barn with the hay track.
People realize that beam is actually dealt inside this beam, right?
Oh
So-
yeah, there's actually a mortise and tenon on that. And that's how you could raise it without it kicking over too.
Yeah.
And that's why I say they would put all the floor joists up, not floor joists, but floor beams would go in first. And the nice thing about the Sierras is you don't have any termites here because the elevation is too high. So that really saves on, I mean, that has saved a lot of barns. And these barns, this barn will last another 500, 800 years as long as it has a roof on it. I mean, there's nothing that's going to chew this beam up. I mean, there's churches in Europe that are, you know, from the 11th century, 10th century, still kicking.
What's the condition between like the sills and what's touching the ground and what's beneath that? How's the ground prepared?
Usually most of these barns are built right where these posts are. There's usually rocks. So they're built, yeah, basically, yeah, you call it, it's a footing. But they didn't really dig deep or worry about it. But that's where all the weight is. And even though this looks like it could be dangerous, I mean, in the sense, I like to see air under the beam, but you know, it's so dry here that they don't seem to rot the beams. I mean, if it was constantly getting wet, they would deteriorate. And that's usually the first thing that goes on the barns are the sills, or if somebody doesn't take care of the roof, then you start getting rot in the tops. But this barn, it looks like everybody's kept pretty good care of it because of the, and you can see another way to date a barn, what I'm thinking about is, that sheathing on the roof tells you that it originally had wood shingles.
Yeah, it did.
Because it's really tight. In some barns, you'll see the sheathing like that, it's separated about 2 or 3 feet. And that means it was built after 1900 because tins, they started manufacturing tin in San Francisco about 1908. And they started using tin for roofs. And that way they didn't have to put as much skip sheeting on the roof. But that tells you that, you know, that the barn did have shingles at one point. And sometimes people even leave them on and put the tin over it. I don't know.
When we bought it, it still had the original 100-year-old shingles on it, painted red. Yeah.
And you took them off and put the tin
We
on?
took them off and put the tin
Yeah.
on, yeah.
Yeah, some people would just put the roofing over the...
And that's full 1-inch wood up there too. That's not thin stuff. That's
That's
heavy wood.
But again, this barn is solid because it has I don't think the rafters are spanning more than 10 feet anywhere, if you look at them. And they look like they appear to be on 2-foot centers, I believe.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm just wondering, what part of Europe were these kinds of mortar and et cetera barns built in?
Well, it's not just barns, houses. In this country, all the houses were built like this up until 1840.
But did this come out of Asia? Because if you go to Japan, all the cathedrals and things there are all built like this. There aren't any nails are.
Yeah, no, the Japanese have the timber frame companies in the world are countries, are basically Western Europe and Eastern Europe, Russia, anywhere they had wood, China, Japan. I mean, they have different styles of the Japanese actually have a layout system themselves, or actually an architectural system that tells them exactly how high walls should be, and spacing between things. The timber framing in America, again, houses were built until the stick framing basically is attributed to be built in Chicago in the 1840s was the first time they built with stud framing. And the cause, basically, the Chicago fires really was an impetus to get things built a lot quicker. And then the cheap manufacturing of nails. Like, that's another way to date a barn, like cut nails. Most of the barns that were built in Carson Valley here, where the nails were built by Henry Van Sickle. He was a blacksmith, and he made the nails, and they're cut nails. That's what they're called, and they still use them in flooring today. And wire nails, the type we're used to now, they came out about 1900. Well, they came out in the 1880s, but by 1900 they took over, as far as nobody was using cut nails anymore. But that's a good way to date a barn too, if it has cut nails in it, or wire nails tells you it's been past that date. But again, when they came out west here, by 1900 back east they were building, or in the Midwest was where the most building was going on. They were experimenting with different type of framing, which was called sandwich framing, where they just take, they would mimic a timber frame, but this would be like two pieces of wood here, and then the brace would fit in between the middle. And I mean, I've seen barns like that in the Sacramento Valley, built a lot like that. But again, in the Sierras, they seem to have done this all the way up to the 1930s. I mean, just keep timber framing.
Well, there's a really interesting joint is over there between the sill and the post, where the sill going this way and the sill going that way and the post coming down all meet in one joint. So
right here, that one?
So if you go on the other side in the dirt and look back this direction, you'll see that joinery there is just really different, or really complex. Yeah.
You can't see it from inside. See, here's an example. This is the only place you can see it. I think you can see it there. That right there, you're looking at a mortise with a cut tenon.
Yeah.
That means, and it's on the other side, so that tells me right there, there used to be a beam going right in here. And you can see real clearly the bladed scarf going up here, and a pin. But you're saying you can see something from the outside here?
No, on this post here, post number.
This one?
Yeah, look down there at the bottom.
Oh, okay, that's exactly, I don't know if anybody can see that from here with the light.
Right.
Well, what you're looking at is that's a cut beam. Well, there used to be a beam right in here.
Oh.
And that's, and they had another one. Yeah, I know why that is. This is they had the sill that you're looking at here used to extend all the way into here on both sides here. For some reason, somebody at some point cut that sill and they put in these side doors, and that's probably for a tractor again.
Or wagons for the granary.
What's that?
Wagons for the granary. So they were hauling grain in there and pulling it up into that grain elevator.
Yeah, but originally they were coming over. There might have been a ramp going up here.
Oh.
Or the floor, but originally there was a sill, because I can see the holes across on both sides.
Okay.
And plus, if you look here, again, I don't know if you can see from there. No, these doors, I don't know if they were, this wasn't opening, you're right. in the sense, but I believe that what they had, because I can see, there were sills on both sides here. So chances are they did that, a lot of barns, like I said, it had the side entry.
Well,
You had a ramp that would go up on this side and a ramp that would come up so that they could drive across there.
we actually wonder if the granary was added later. So that may not have originally been there, especially when you look at that beam right below, there's no, on both sides, it doesn't have a good connection vertically. It just is tied into the rafter, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, it very well could have been added on. I mean, this could have been the end of the original barn.
Yeah, yeah.
Right here, and that could have been added on. Yeah, there's a lot of detective work in these things. But I think there's something about it though, that there was an opening there. Because of the fact that I could see on both ends of the barn, there's mortises there, so there was a complete sill.
Just like on the ends over here, yeah.
Yeah, and there was a sill on that side too.
And you can see where they're cut part way up to the beam going around the top.
Right. Yeah, right there, because they had no need to be that high up, yeah.
Yeah, we have a picture of what it was like back then before the big doors.
Oh, before the big doors. Cool.
So, Paul, would it make sense for people to walk around, look at the granaries, and
Yeah.
you can point
Yeah,
out some
especially
of
before it
the,
gets dark.
before it gets dark, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.